A few months ago, I was scrolling through Instagram looking for tips on how to be a better communicator. And I just realized what a millennial I sound like. But I did run across this guy named René Rodriguez. Over the last 25 years, René has researched and applied behavioral neuroscience to solve some of the toughest challenges in leadership, sales, and change. I loved his content and his way of breaking down why certain communication tactics work and why some don't. I read his book, Amplify Your Influence, and had him on the show to talk about not only how to be a better communicator, but also how we can settle into our skin a little bit more. In this conversation, you're gonna hear the differences between being a good storyteller and a well, not so good. How to tactically lean into your nerves when you're feeling inferior, and how to challenge ideas without being divisive. René also told me to keep being quirky, so you know I liked him.
A lot of people confuse loudness with power. That's not the case. And the one that's the most dangerous is usually the quietest. So what if feeling confident wasn't part of the equation? What if feeling confident wasn't the determining factor? What you call quirky personality, I would call a change in stimulus, the dopamine hit. Like just when you're telling a story and you do...
It's not quirky, it's a change in stimulus. All right, y'all. So René, I read your bio and all that cool stuff. I found you on Instagram several months ago. I have been mildly obsessed over the past few months of learning storytelling and trying to figure out how to use this gift that I believe God's given me, which is communication, and try to hone it in a little bit and step in from like hobbyist to professional. So I always go to Instagram and look for reels and so forth. And I ran across you and just binge through a bunch of your content. And luckily for me, you agreed to come on this show. But before I start hammering you with all these questions, I wanted to tell you that we've had this book for months, and I didn't tell anyone that I had you coming on the show. But for some reason, you've come up in conversations probably 2 or 3 times. I don't know how, but just randomly somebody will bring up your name. And without fail, every person has said that you are the kindest and most genuine person that they know. And
wow.
That meant a lot to me because I was like, okay, this dude obviously knows a lot about influence, but he is actually influencing people for the good. So I wanted you to know people are talking about you like that, which I'm sure you probably already know. So thanks, René,
really cool
for coming on. First question for you. You said curveballs, so this is a good one. All right.
I like curveballs.
I heard on another interview that at 18 years old, your mom gave you a book called Lions Don't Need to Roar. And I heard in another interview that when you were 18, you were watching like Jim Rohn's sales videos. And I was thinking, what was this dude doing at 18 years old to be investing in his personal development and sales at that young of an age? Did you come out of the womb knowing you were going to do what you're doing now?
You know, what's interesting is the answer why I was lucky to have good people around me that handed me those things. So my mother, she's been doing this kind of work, well, she had been doing this kind of work since I can remember. And so everything that I learned in the beginning was watching her. She was a nun. Oh yeah, she was a nun. I should play for you afterwards. I'll show you a video that shows my 30-year journey. It begins with her. And I remember seeing her speak for the first time at 17 years old and realizing that immediately I'm like, okay, like what I want to do is right in front of me. But I was a basketball player. I didn't know how to do any of that stuff. And I got cut from my college basketball team. So then that left me with no basketball career, and I hated school. And so I got a chance to ask a CEO, what's the one thing I needed to do to be in his shoes when he got older? And he just looked at me and smiled, and he said, you learn how to sell. If you learn how to sell, you'll always be employed. And I was like, okay, at 18, you don't really ask any questions. And I got recruited to work for selling cookware door to door. So I did that because I was told to go sell, and I didn't have anything else to do. That's when the franchise owner, my boss, gave me, this thing, this cassette. I'd always seen on this 30 Days to Personal Power, Tony Robbins tape series. I don't know if you're old enough to remember tapes, but cassette tapes. And I remember seeing in my mom's closet forever. I never knew who this guy with big teeth was. And then he handed me this thing from Zig Ziglar on goal setting. And I'm like, okay, I listened to that. And his voice was, at the first, was very harsh. And then you grew to love it. And I listened to it probably 5 times. And I'm like, okay, give me another one. This is great. Like, there's a process to setting goals and achieving things. Then he gives me Jim Rohn, Take Charge of Your Life. And I put that on, and I was like, I was hooked. I've listened to Jim Rohn's Take Charge of Your Life 300-400 times, over and over and over and over and over again. So I saw that. I was like, okay. And then I remember them talking about this guy named Anthony Robbins. I'm like, is that the guy in my mom's closet? And then I went and grabbed that whole cassette series and I just started listening to that. And then Awaken the Giant Within. And it was just like this thing. I was just hungry for it. And probably because I didn't have that kind of guidance. My mom, I didn't know my father, but my mom worked a lot. So she was a guide, but in her own way and how she could do it. But I didn't have the sort of that daily conversation. And that became that. And so I was just hooked early.
So when you said she was a former nun, I heard you say that somewhere else, and I thought it was a joke because you were usually, start a little joke about that at the beginning about like you're grateful she's not a nun anymore. She really was a nun, and she left that. Did she leave the religion or just leave being a nun?
She was an Adrian Dominican for 8 years on the border of Haiti, and so she would teach children how to read and write. And there's a lot of guerrilla warfare going on, a lot of craziness, and of course after the Cuban Revolution and kind of being part of all that, there was a lot of crazy, interesting stories. And then one day, her goal in life was global peace and community. And so she decided one day that this was not going to be the most effective way for her to have maximum impact. And so she told Mother Superior, she said, I think this is my last year here. She said, if you already know this is your last, then this is your last day. You leave tomorrow. And she was gone the next day. So she started working with migrant labor in Southern Florida as sort of her way to empower and help people and to bring them to light. And that began a whole series of learnings for her that became sort of the backdrop of her work and truly the backdrop of my work too, which is something we actually don't talk about enough. I probably should more, but she was like, watching a culturally Catholic country turn communist in 6 months in Cuba is wild. I mean, how do you create that kind of massive change so quickly? And businesses can't do it in years, but they did it in 6 months. I mean, culturally Catholic and become communist. 6 months. Well, they did it very differently. They walked the fields. They took over the education system. They took over the media, and they would literally walk the fields and talk to the farmers. They didn't mandate it. It was just this. The soldiers were part of the process, and fascinating to watch that. She also, in the beginning of the revolution, felt that her belief system was if the change was good, then and people died in the process, it was okay. Some people have to die in a process, right? Just part of the change process. But what you realize that if you kill your way into power, when you're confronted with an issue, when you're in power, you're just going to go back to what you you're going to resort back to what you learned and what you've been practicing, which is killing. And so realize then that the end does not justify the means. The means needs to reflect the end. So the road to heaven needs to be heaven. If you're going to be peaceful, then you need to do it in peaceful ways. And there's, and some may disagree with that. And, the whole premise of war is to show an act of strength, to show to deter, which I can see the logic in that too.
Yeah.
But I think that if you're going to be a leader and you want to lead with compassion, you want to lead with empathy, and you don't lead with the opposite of that. And then once I get into power, I'll be compassionate, empathetic. You'll have no practice. And so and that doesn't mean, by the way, weakness. It's just a reflection of doing those things along the way. Then she, watched, cities leveled after when she moved to Germany. Well, by the way, she lived in 5 countries before the age of 25. So Cuba before and after the Cuban Revolution, Germany right after the Holocaust and the war, Panama during the Panama Canal crisis, was in the border of Haiti as a nun with the guerrilla warfare, and then in Las Vegas during the A-bomb testing. So it was like all of this war, revolutionary thinking. And so my mom was different, very different. And, Y2K, if you remember that, and the whole thing.
Oh, yeah. She
hoarded everything, and she forced us to go shopping because she was used to stuff like that happening. And it was fascinating just to remember how she grew up. And then, there's like 15 other lessons that came from that process that created a foundation of the work that we do.
That's what I was going to ask you. Growing up with your mom just sounds like a complete badass. Like, that is so cool. I mean, how has that shifted and shaped your worldview when you're entering into this conversation of influence and communication and so forth? Because reading your book, listening to your work, I can feel a subtle difference there. And I haven't been able to pinpoint it. I do have one guess of a word I'll bring up later. But in your mind, having that kind of background, how have you approached this conversation of influence differently than maybe someone else?
I think it grounds me in a different place. And I'm not saying it's better. It just grounds me in a different place. So go back to your question around lions don't need to roar. What she taught me was what real power was. Real power was the elder in a native tribe that was silent and just listened. But if he wanted to, he could banish you. Doesn't mean he will.
Yeah.
But it was more listening, that the power was in listening and to gathering perspective. still holding court and still making sure that there's order, but didn't need to yell and scream. And a lot of people confuse loudness with power. That's not the case. And the one that's the most dangerous is usually the quietest. And they have nothing to prove because they've already know themselves. They know what they're capable of. They know what is there, but they also have a bigger picture in mind. So they're not trying to do this. And it's a funny thing that, you know, people misunderstand what the alpha energy is. And alpha usually seen as dominant and protective and fighting. It's not what it is. It can, but that's not the purpose. The purpose of an alpha is harmony. It's to keep the peace, and it's to ensure fairness and ensure that there's a community. And at times there may need to be a sense of aggression, but that's the last resort. It's usually diplomatic, and it's usually empowering. And when there is disharmony, the betas get together and they will oust the alpha until somebody comes in and puts order in place. And, you know, I think Lion King was a great example of the alpha, and Mufasa, and was a kind and gentle king, but you wouldn't mess with him.
Right. There has to be a deep sense of security. And, you know, you talk a lot about, you know, the self-awareness piece of who you are to be able to show up in that and not have to prove something or dominate. The self-consciousness that comes with communication. Man, I told you at the beginning, this show, the idea of it, the premise is I wanted to be able to gather all the folks who didn't feel like they belonged in a room and nurture that inside of them to give voice. And it obviously takes years of practice and reps. But man, that security within yourself that I'm okay showing up as Heather freaking Parody in whatever room that I'm in, man, it takes a lot of work. And I wanted you to speak to the nervousness piece, because I think out of anything that I struggle with, it's probably the nerve element. And I'm weird because I overcompensate sometimes. Instead of like getting shaky, I get really quiet and almost reserved. And I've noticed that in myself. And I've been working on it. But I wanted to get your opinion about calming your nerves and feeling like you belong in a room.
So what if feeling confident wasn't part of the equation? What if feeling confident wasn't the determining factor? And I pose it as a question. And because I think we wait for things like that to happen before we step out. But what if motivation didn't matter? The things that I've come to find out from those that are most influential, successful, and I say quotes around successful, are the ones that don't depend on motivation. They rely on discipline. And I do this because this is what I do. I hate it. I'm scared, but I still do it. And there's a sense of any dependency on something outside of oneself, that which you cannot control, is where the problem typically begins. It's a promise that will never deliver. That's the pursuit of happiness, which really is the pursuit of the dopamine high that doesn't last. And so I go, well, in my mind, I'm like, well, what if confidence didn't matter? What if nerves were good? What if I'm not trying to get rid of the nerves? What if the nerves served a purpose? And I embraced that. Then all of a sudden, because the power is given to that when we try to run from it. And then when it comes, we crumble. Versus, you're here, nerves, welcome. Yeah, I knew you'd show up. Let's go do this anyways. My mentor taught me, he says, René, the butterflies will never go away, but you can teach them to fly in formation. And that's a quote that's in my book. I accurately quoted that person, so I make sure that we get an accurate quote there. But the concept is when you eliminate its power, like a lot of times, like I'll give you an example. It's like if somebody's speaking and you see a shaking glass, right? And they're talking, and I say, can you influence somebody with a shaking glass and invisible nerves? And people say, no. I said, okay, well, if I'm saying, guys, I'm really excited to be here, you know, just a lot of great stuff. And, you know, you'd be paying attention to the nerves instead, the glass that's shaking. But if you were visibly nervous and you said, you know, folks, I am nervous doing this. This is not easy for me to do. And it's not easy because this work matters to me. And all of a sudden there's a congruency that's there with word and body and behavior. And it's the congruency that we want versus versus, you know, polish. I'd rather have congruency over polish. And so a lot of people will think that I have to eliminate all these nerves, these aesthetic things, versus saying it's part of the process. I want to move away from awkwardness. What if awkwardness was a requirement for growth? Which it is. There is no growth without first going through moments of awkwardness and failure.
Preach.
Even when I get frustrated around conversations around failure, I'm like, well, how about we just stop making it a conversation and realize it's part of the process? Well, it's like, let's talk. What do you think about breathing? You have to breathe. Well, what do you think about failure? You have to fail. So let's stop giving it so much power and start embracing the reality that it's just part of the process. And I have to fail. And the sooner I fail and the faster and more often I fail, the better I get. It needs a rebrand.
Yeah. You said somewhere you used to be nervous when you first started speaking and getting in
Still
front
am.
of folks. No way.
Oh yeah, 100%.
How?
Because you should be. The moment that I'm not is the moment that I've become complacent. As I stop caring, I stop trying, I stop trying to raise my own bar, and I've done that several times. And I can go back to go, man, I got too comfortable, and on stage I wasn't as ready as I should have, and I failed the audience. And so the nerves are good. I'm like, okay, I got to breathe. And it's not like any basketball player, professional athlete doesn't get nervous. They do. They just know how to manage it. And so there's a relationship with the nerves that works really well. And the thing is, it's like, if I were shocked that I was nervous, then I'd be like, oh my God, I'm nervous. Am I going to fail? Versus, yep, I'm nervous. This is part of the process. Now I breathe,
Yeah.
which is the next part of the process. And then I ask myself, why? Do I feel prepared? And I go through the checklist. Am I prepared? Have I done the work? And then I go, you know what? I'm trying to be impressive. I got to stop trying to be impressive and just express what I feel. Move from impress to express. And so I go through all of this stuff every single time. It doesn't go away. It doesn't go away at all. And I think the underlying philosophy of that is, what's my purpose on that stage? When I say stage, I'm quoting that. It's stage meaning I'm on stage right now with you. We're both on a stage. People are going to be watching this.
Yeah.
Is my purpose to be impressive, or is it to express? But really, at the end of the day, it's here to serve. Right now, it's here to serve your audience, to serve you. You're giving me a platform, and my platform is not to take, it's to serve. And that changes the whole piece. If I'm trying to impress, then I'm trying to name drop. I'm trying to show how cool I am. I'm trying to talk about things and accolades, versus if I'm here to serve, then I'm listening to the little things, and I'm trying to find out what is important to you, and how do I utilize my experience to lend value to you and to your audience. And the fundamental deep shift that happens not only in my performance, but also in the experience of the person, is what I believe is the secret to it. But it's easier said than done. That's what takes practice.
Because they can feel it. They can feel your intention energetically of where it's placed.
Yeah.
Ding, ding, ding. You said almost exactly what I had written down here. Remember how I told you that I felt like there was something a little bit different about your approach and your work? I had written down empathy, and you have a formula, right, that you go through in your book of communication and influence. And one of the pieces is tie down. And you have a whole chapter on that. And I wanted to read this section right here, because I think it speaks to what you just said. You said, too often people assume that just because they have spoken clearly, their message has been heard. They also assume that the listener can connect all the dots, and that the listeners know what has been said or presented and what it means to them. And this is a dangerous assumption. And when I read that, I was like, goodness sakes, Heather, you make everything about you. Oh my goodness. If you could just shift everything into real, and I know we say that because it sounds really sexy, like, oh, serve people or whatever. But truly and really putting all of the focus and attention empathetically on that listener will help you frame everything. It'll help you know what stories to tell, what tie downs, because you're thinking about it, that experience. My friend, I feel like that's what you bring to the table that's so different, that I haven't really heard a lot of people talk about. But getting out of my selfishness, that's another ball game. So
Well, I think sometimes the selfishness is unintentional. It's actually, sometimes we reach selfishness with a good intent because we want to be really good. And so there's a really positive intent there that has the opposite outcome. And so some people say it would be selfish. They have such a negative connotation to that. So sometimes we're unintentionally selfish for the wrong reason. Sometimes we have to be selfish. Like I said, be selfish on this podcast, because I think that'll actually serve your audience. And it's agreed upon thing. Okay, I'm going to ask every question I can and get as much out of this. And then there's the unintentional and selfish in the truest definition of focus on oneself, right? Meaning my feelings and my desire to be impressive can have the opposite effect of what's going on. And then when you're focused on serving, you're actually focused more on listening, and you can't dupe the system on it. It's either you can't pretend to be. You have to truly be in that place, and it comes from the underlying belief system. Somebody said, René, thanks for showing up today. I was doing a keynote, and I'm like, thank me? I go, thank you. I go, do you know how silly I look on that stage with no one in the audience? I go, trust me. I said, most of my career was to an empty audience. And so I said, I'm here to serve you. The fact that you showed up means everything. And that's not just a line. I know it sounds good, but it's what I really feel. And why do I really feel that? Because I know what an empty audience feels like really well.
Yeah. How do you actively listen and empathize when you're delivering something that's been worked on for months and months and months? So let me give you an example. You're standing on a stage and maybe you're delivering something and you put in all the prep work, but maybe energetically you don't feel like people are receiving it. Is that something you change in the moment? Are you that present, or you do? You're shaking your head. Yeah.
100%. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. So people ask, like, people talk about mindfulness. Can you be mindful on stage? Practice mindfulness. 100%. I'm solely on this stage and I'm solely paying attention to the body language and the energy in the room. There is an energy in the room, and this isn't hokey. I mean, you can feel the presence, you can feel distractions from people, you can feel disassociations, you can feel disinterest, you can also feel engagement. You can feel there's so many micro expressions being shared with you from that stage. And if you're just really in tune with it and fully present, you can do that. And if your goal is to serve, and then of course, I mean, there's a practice to this, right? You know, there's if the audience is disengaged, I go into a deeper story, more vulnerable. The superpower there is vulnerability. And when it's almost the opposite, because the last thing you want to do when people are disengaged is to share more of yourself, because they're going to be less interested in actually who you are. But the paradox is the more that vulnerable you are, the more people engage. And so it's a lot of this is paradoxical.
How do you tie in a story though when there's not any coming to you? Is this just a practice thing? Like you have to, because that seems like a lot of improv to me. Because if I'm on stage and I'm really effing it up, which has happened, it has happened. My mind starts, I guess it goes back to the breathing piece that you were talked about, being in the moment. But like, if you have everything prepped and stuff, I mean, stories readily available that you just pop in there or what?
Absolutely. Well, you think about it is it's like, okay, and I'll do this in our class all the time, because they're trying to say, well, what if they take you on a different route? And it's like, well, do you know where you're going? Like we talk about ethos, pathos, logos,
Yeah.
kairos, and telos, right? So talking about telos, which is the end goal. And I have somebody, we're sitting in an L shape. Imagine sitting in an L shape. And I say, John, I said, I want you to come up and grab this cup of coffee. And I just said, come grab a cup of coffee. So he stands up, moves his chair, walks around other people and grabs a cup of coffee. And I said, great. Did I need to outline the steps you needed to take, or were you clear on the outcome? He was clear on the outcome. I said, okay, great. Go back. So John, grab his cup of coffee. And he comes over and I move a chair in his way. And he just stops and he turns around and goes the other way. So a chair in the way is a curveball that somebody throws you. You still know where you're going. You still know exactly where you're headed. You just might have to take a different route to get there. And so a lot of people lose sight of the end purpose or the outcome of their goal. But then there's the practice side of this too, where you go, okay, so what's the purpose of storytelling? You had asked storytelling. A lot of people think storytelling is the outcome. Storytelling is a means by which
Right.
to achieve something, which is influence. But still people don't get it. And I know that when people don't get it, because they'll usually say, I have a story I want to share with people. And my first response, just to be a little shocking, I go, no one cares about your story. And they look at me like, I go, but don't you teach storytelling? I go, absolutely.
Yeah.
I go, but no one cares about your story. I go, well, what do you mean? I go, think about it this way. I said, what's the purpose? What's the difference between a really good storyteller and someone who loves to tell stories? There's one difference.
Objective goal.
Well, the difference is the one who is a really good storyteller used a story to deliver a message of value. They used the story. They didn't use your time just to tell you a story.
Damn, that's so good.
And the difference at the end of that is just, it's worlds apart, because they go, well, this guy sits, like, they go, oh my God, they're telling a story again. Really what they're saying is they're going to waste my time for no reason at all, versus somebody who's a really good storyteller. You just get engaged because you know there's this beautiful lesson at the end of it. There's something valuable at the end. And so the vehicle is story.
That's so good. And what's been interesting is trying to figure out what is the necessary part of that story versus what am I just being romantic about because I'm attached to this sentence and this word. And the elimination process has been interesting for me lately. Even some of my quirky personality, because I want to show a little bit of that in the story. And sometimes I'll make a little comment here and there. But then my question comes back, is that serving the story? Is
Well, I
that
think it
helpful or
keeps
is it
people
deterring?
engaged.
You think
I
so?
think it keeps people engaged. Yeah, absolutely. Because what you call quirky personality, I would call a change in stimulus, the dopamine hit. Like just
Ooh,
when
I'm
you're
gonna
telling a
start using
story
that,
and you
y'all.
do, what's that?
So I'm going to start using that. It's not quirky. It's a change in stimulus.
It is. What
I
keeps
like
what
it.
is, if I were to talk in a monotone voice like this, there is no change in stimulus. And after a while, your brain habituates to that. But when you have a little curveball here and there in the story, it little hits of dopamine along the way. Dopamine is created through novelty as well. And so a little novelty, a little hashtag, a little, this is what's happening here. It's a side note, keeps things interesting. And so the big piece is, of course, you're saying the elimination process, how much of the story should you tell? If you are focused on just wanting to tell the story, you will have no insight as to when to stop. If you are using a story to achieve an outcome and you're clear on the outcome and you see the outcome achieved, you know you've done enough. And so what we tell people is that how much do you share? As much as necessary, but as little as possible. And it's not to be cryptic. It's you've achieved the goal. And so now let's move forward. That's storytelling in business, by the way.
Yeah.
Storytelling in business, as much as necessary, but as little as possible.
Well, I mean, it's similar to with like screenwriters and novelists and all of that. Is they always, what is it? Stephen King, cut the darlings or whatever. Just eliminate, eliminate, eliminate. Here's another thing. I don't know if you picked this up or not, but my hands are all over the place. I move quite a bit, and there's some good stuff in that. But sometimes I wonder about like over dopamine people. You know what I mean? You don't.
It's all
Because I
good.
sometimes get complaints. People will say, girl, you use your hands too much, you're a little too squirmy, but this is, if you were having dinner with me, like, this is what you would see. And so it's been kind of interesting trying to shave that, I guess.
Don't shave it. Keep it going.
I like you, man.
So here's why I say that. There are people there's experiencing something and then there's auditing something. Those are two very different things. So if I'm experiencing you, I'm not auditing how you do it. I'm experiencing something, just who you are, and I take in the whole. And when you look at the research, hand gestures are one of the most important things for not only attention grabbing, because they paint pictures, but it's also for memory, because you use gestures, I use gestures to help my memory, right? You're like, oh, what was that one thing? And we things that just trigger memory.
Yeah.
But also it does that. So they did a study on, and I'm going to butcher the numbers a little bit, on the top quartile of TED Talks and the bottom TED Talks. Bottom sort of segment of TED Talks had an average of 137,000 views and about 257 hand gestures approximately. But the top quartile had 4.3 million views. That's exponential from 137 to 4.3 million, but 465 hand gestures. And so hand gestures are huge. They're critical, especially in like a Zoom call, right? Because this can become very stale. This little box that we speak in becomes very stale. And so you have to move your hands and use things. If people wear glasses, take them off every once in a while, put them back on. If you're writing notes, show your pencil every once in a while. And those things just kind of break up the monotony. But somebody that's why focus groups in marketing aren't all that accurate, because it doesn't put them in an experiential fashion. They're saying, what do you think of this product? And somebody who has no experience in, looking at product utility or thinking from a customer perspective, they just say, well, and they start giving, that's an auditing process. It never really works. If I'm doing a training session and I have run into this all the time for a big corporate client, they say, well, we're going to send our HR and learning development to audit the thing. And I look at the leader, and I go, okay, they're welcome to come. One condition, they're not auditing, they're participants. And if you can remove that they're there to audit, then it's going to help you. You can still bring them to audit, but I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. They're going to say, oh, I read that book. Yep, we talk about emotional intelligence. Yep. Oh, hand gestures, body language. We have a module for that. And they're not experiencing the whole of the experience versus the individual parts. And there's no value in that. And it's usually pretty inaccurate.
That's fascinating. I'm sure you've heard people say, because I've heard, when I started in these reels, people would DM me and they'd be like, I would love to tell more stories, communicate, but I don't have that personality, Heather. I don't have that. Maybe I'm a little more reserved or quiet and so forth. You mentioned like small things like picking up your pencil or moving your glasses and so forth. But I think, what are we, the end to the mean, I guess? What's our goal here with the movement? Because I think if we understand that, we know what fits our personality.
So why do we like watching movies versus reading the text? Why do we prefer a well-positioned visual aid versus just gathering the information? Why do you need in-person presentations? Why can't you just mail me the data?
I don't know.
Well, think about it. We need other forms of stimulus to be able to truly engage: auditory, visual, kinesthetic. There's all sorts of things that are involved in the learning process. And story is a great way, because story is how we memorize things and how we remember things.
Yeah.
It's all done through narrative. And narratives are constructs of reality. And so we're we make sense of the world through the narrative. And if you're really good at narrative and story, and you can take an idea and put it in a story format to deliver a message, it'll be remembered. And without memory, there's no change, there's no action, there's no execution, there's no referral, memory is a huge underappreciated component of all of this. And so every time I'm speaking, I'm thinking, how does this become memorable? Versus going to a talk at a conference and it's like it's on a high, but as soon as you leave, you don't remember anything. You get on there, people yelling at you, you got to dominate your day. Every day, wake up and dominate. And you're like, oh, I'm going to dominate my day. And you write that down and 2 days goes by and you wake up in the morning and you don't feel real dominant at that moment. You kind of feel like a human and you don't have the adrenaline running through your body. And you're like, oh, I'll go to my notes. I got to dominate today. What the hell does that mean?
Yeah. Word.
It's just like, what does that mean? And I refuse to be that person. I would much rather burn an idea into your soul through good story, through heartfelt emotion, through mind-blowing logic, through a conversation, through an example that makes sense, through a philosophy, through a connection to values, so that now all of a sudden you wake up and you can't get that story out of your head. You can't get that visual out of it. It haunts you. Now that's lasting.
With that, a lot of these stories are very personal and they involve other people. One of the stories in your book, you talk, and it made me laugh. I know it wasn't probably meant as humorous, but it was when you were in New York and all the lights went out and there's just this crazy power outage at New York. People were panicking, which is not funny. But what René did was funny because he pulled out like a notepad and you were taking down what was going on in the world. Yeah, you were mining stories, which I love. I've done that. And then sometimes I'll look back at that list and I'll go, is it okay for me to share that story about that stranger I met? And that's I guess a little easier of an answer, but it comes a little bit more difficult when it's maybe my mom or my dad or people who could be hurt.
Still around. Yeah.
How do you navigate that?
I get that question a lot because we do a lot of origin story exploration with people to say where they come from. And a good percentage of that comes from mom and dad. And the reality is some of those stories aren't nice. And guess what? We're all human. My kids are going to tell stories about shitty things I did. And one of the things I did with my kids was say, hey, by the way, I'm a lighthouse and a foghorn to you. There's some things that I did great and you should follow and let me guide you. But there's certain things that you need to go, whoa, warning sign, do not be like dad. And I go, and you need to be okay telling me that. I'm going to tell you right now, it is okay to have that conversation with me anytime you want. And I think parents need to normalize the conversation with their kids about where we were human, where we did the best that we could, and allow them a space to talk about it. I know that's ideal, and not everybody does. Right. So that what people have to do is they have to navigate. I think there's ways to share stories. If the message is more important than the story, then you can change certain details to protect people's dignity and their privacy. There's a mentor I had growing up. Instead of saying my mom, there are people that I had in my life that, I needed them to be there for me and they weren't. The details of who really doesn't matter because I know that individual did the best they could. And it's possible for people to do the best they could and still not serve the needs of somebody. That is called being human. It's the human experience. And now I got to deal with what that means. And now I've told enough of that story to illustrate why I'm there, but I've also protected the integrity of that person. So is the detail in that moment is necessary? Is it worth hurting the individual? It might not be. But now, I'll tell you this. There's some people that were just horrific parents and that to this day don't care what the child says. Then I say, you know what? Tell your story. If they weren't there to provide any healing for you, you got to do it on your own. And they dug their grave, not you. You're being who you need to be, period. And if they get hurt by it, then, hey, I wanted to talk to you. You didn't want to talk. So I had to do something about it, and it's in that sense, I think people have to assess for themselves how much they want to share and they don't share.
Well said. You just said that you get asked that question a lot. And right when you said that, I thought, damn, well, what questions do you never get asked that you think are really important that no one thinks about? I wish people would ask me this more often.
What should they be asking? Give me more context. I can think about it in several contexts. Let's just say in speaking, I'll just go, and then you think of one as I go here. So let's say in speaking, What they should be asking is not how do I get on your stage? Because everybody, they ask me, say, Renee, I want to get on your stage someday, or I want to speak next to you. And my response always is, I go, even though it's my stage, I don't choose who goes on my stage.
Right.
And they look at me like crazy. I'm like, what do you mean? I go, my audience does. I'm there to serve an audience. And so you need to saying, what do I have to do to become that attractive person? What do I need to do to create the audience? That's the question. How do I get more reps in versus how do I get to the end goal? Well, reps are everything. You want to run a podcast, you better do about 100 crappy podcasts before you get good at it. I mean, how long did it take for you to figure out your lighting in your reels? I mean, your lighting is fantastic. Like you've got the shadows and then the sort of the dramatic look, and that takes effort and time. I guarantee you your first ones weren't like that.
No.
And your audio, like people, well, how do I use a microphone? Well, if I'm not putting it in front of my mouth, it doesn't sound good. But now I get it in front of my mouth and it sounds great. And so learning all those details, it's all about reps and putting the time in. But
What about the storytelling, though? I want to know about that. What should people be asking about storytelling?
what should they be asking about storytelling? I think it's, maybe you should be asking, how do I explore more of my own story? Because I think it goes back to people saying they want to share the story, but really what's the purpose of the story? And as somebody who believes that story is so critical, I also don't lose sight of what the purpose of it is. It's the Trojan horse. So let's analyze a Trojan horse. Like, why was the Trojan horse? What was the Trojan horse? Like, what was the purpose of the Trojan horse?
It's a big ass horse. I don't know. I have no idea.
So they couldn't penetrate the forces, right? So there was defenses up. And if they came and attacked with their message, they just would have been met with opposition. Instead, they said, here's a gift, right? We made this beautiful horse for you. Here's a gift. Now, what did that gift do? It lowered the defenses so that now once they were past the defenses, they could release the message, which were the soldiers on the inside. Now they released a message of death. But let's get rid of what the message was and look at the formula. I have to lower the defenses before I can communicate.
Yeah.
And so the story is what does that. It lowers the defenses. So then I can open up messages of love, messages of hate, messages of tolerance, messages of intolerance, messages of empathy, you name it. And and that's the premise of the whole book is around not so much how do I communicate to you, but how do I prep my audience to be able to listen?
Yeah.
And that's the piece of it.
Doing that online is hard, man. Like really, really tricky when you don't see the faces. And I mean, I'm primarily communicating digitally, and I know that you have a whole training on that and you help folks do it. And this right here, there's all these little tactics of, you were getting our heads right and, looking at the camera, which I totally don't do. I need to do more often. Like those little things matter, bring humanity in a digital landscape. But it's also too frustrating as a storyteller when, I want deeply to impact the folks who are watching these reels. But besides the like, that was cool, Heather, I don't really get that kind of feedback. And I don't want to use views as a measure because that's so fickle, right?
It's a part of it.
I guess.
It's a part of it. It's not everything, but it's a part of it. We don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You don't design your whole life around views, but it's a measure, one of many. But I think, the secret to looking is I look through a teleprompter. So I can see you and the cameras on the other side of the mirror. So I can see you, you can see me. That's one of the innovations that we came up with. Shout out to Ryan Grams of Studio Upgrade. That's his invention. But, when we're looking at, and you'd said, what was that? The measures and, so we're talking about how do you do this digitally? Well, the big realization I had was pre-pandemic, pre-Zoom, I was teaching storytelling to audiences and how do you do keynotes and how do you run meetings and things like that. And then I tried doing the same thing, and so did many speakers, digitally, and it just didn't work. And the reason was, one, the difference between two things, a captive audience and a non-captive audience. So if you're speaking in person, if you're at a keynote, you have a captive audience. They can't swipe you. They can't scroll you. They're sitting physically in a chair. And so starting off with, it was May 15th, 1961. And this story, or I remember when I was a kid, my mother used to tell me, like, that's a great way to start a message in a keynote or a meeting with a captive audience. The moment you do that on Instagram, you go, so I remember when I was a scroll, just doesn't work. And so that paradigm had to shift where we said, okay, it's non-captive audience. That's the first question. Is it captive or is it non-captive? If it's captive, begin with story. If it's non-captive, begin with hook. And the hook is a 3-second audition for attention. 3-second audition, meaning you are not entitled to that person's attention. Even if you have a following, you have to pretend that they don't know you and you don't know them. So you can't use inside language. You can't use inside jokes. You have to get really clear and keep it simple within 3 seconds for me to watch. And people say they write hooks, they don't. The only way you know if you're writing hooks, unfortunately, is your view count. That's the only way. And because that shows that people are watching. So that measures your first 3 seconds, in my opinion. And so I used to get so angry about that. And I was trying to change the world, say people need to grow up and realize that, content isn't found in less than a minute. You have to actually, life changes requires more than a minute. So you should stop being impatient. Instead of me surrendering to the reality that maybe I'm the guy saying, well, the music in my era was better.
Yep.
Instead of saying, this is today's world and how do I adapt to it?
Yep.
And that's what we had to do.
I just wanted to lean into that a little bit more because so much of story is that land, right? And the delivery. And there's so much I feel like lost when I'm cutting something down into 60 seconds to really let something breathe.
Mm-hmm.
And so the wrestle between letting a message land and breathe a little bit, but also in our new communication world where we need that new dopamine, it's been interesting figuring out how to tighten things without losing the energetic life in something. I'd love your thoughts on that in general.
I had to change what my outcome goal was for this and realize that there's a journey that we're taking them on. Step 1 of the journey is intrigue and curiosity versus lesson and learning. Now, if you can get the lesson, some you can get across in 60 seconds. Sometimes I just need to intrigue you and make you ask questions so that you watch the long form version of that. So like the purpose of whatever reels we create here would be to create intrigue and an open loop. Okay, like the end of a show, like what's the answer to that? A lot of people are really good at these podcasts where you'll ask me a question and maybe a tough one and I'll say something like, well, you know what, people aren't going to like my answer. And then it goes to your logo and like that. And so then it's like, okay. And that's really smart because it's surrendering to the reality that that's how we function. You caught my attention, high five. Okay. Click to watch the full answer. So let's go and watch the full answer. And so I had to surrender to reality that my goal was to create intrigue and to deliver a short, simple message. And like, that's the problem, by the way. That's the hardest part about TED Talks. I did 2 TED Talks and they're still the 2 hardest talks I've ever given in my life.
Really?
And the secret of a TED Talk is one idea. And the hard part about creating a TED Talk is sticking to one idea. And I have trained a lot of people on TED Talks right before they come to me. I got a TED Talk, one first, high five. That's not an easy thing to do. And then people that do TED Talk type things, which is 20 minutes or less, 17 minutes or less. And I go, here's your thing. You got to stick to one idea. And they're like, yeah, I have one idea. And they'll present it to me. And I go, I counted 7. I go, what's the one of the 7? Here are the 7 I counted. They're like, oh my God. And then they start feeling like they all matter. They're all important. I said, what is the one idea? And when you can finally whittle it down to one, and a lot of times it's like you realize that it's not that you don't have enough time.
Yeah.
It's that you haven't gotten clear enough. And so there's an old adage that says, hey, what does it cost for you to do an hour keynote? And I'll be like, $45,000. And okay, well, what if you just came in and did 20 minutes? I said $65,000. Like, well, how's shorter more expensive? I said, do you know how much more time and effort I got to figure out to still move your audience in less time, and what I got to cut out and how much clearer I got to get? And it's 3 times the work. And so it's the idea that it's when you really put the time in, and people don't realize how much time and effort you put into really nailing that message in 60 seconds. It's like I've got a really good person that does it for me, Mo Ismail. You should follow him. He's amazing. He's the one that came to me and said, René, you're doing this all wrong. And I was in the place. I'm like, it's not the place for me. Social media is just not the place for me. I do better with people in person, all that stuff. And he kind of laughed. He goes, no, René, he goes, you have good stuff. The world needs it. I'm just going to show you how. And he grew our account to over 1 million followers on TikTok in less than 6 months. And I think we just passed 200,000 on Instagram like this last week, which was really cool. And this is all in a year's time. So the wild ride of me surrendering to that and then learning still how to get clear on what's the one idea, just one, and being okay that there's there's a YouTube, you can watch the full thing if you want, or there's other contextual things, or go to my website. There's other stuff there. But what if I just give you one idea? And that's the practice and the discipline.
I'm going to push on that a little bit. You said I could push on you a little bit.
Push away.
Let's go. So this one idea, you have said a few times, and I'm going to paraphrase this, that influence. It's easy to say hamburgers are awesome to a whole bunch of hamburger lovers and they'll all agree with you, but it's different whenever you can present an idea and actually make someone who disagrees with you think about what you're saying. And I like that, Renee, but also there's this thing inside of me that revolts against any kind of controversy. And I know that's not what you were saying, but I think I've seen so much of that in my life that my goal has been to be a bridge. I always think about a bridge. I want to connect people together. And I think I may be thinking about this wrong. But when you said that about being able to, if your message challenge other people, I want to figure out a way how to challenge, I guess, folks, but do it in a way that is that bridge,
Yeah.
And maybe I'm being too weak. I don't know.
No, I don't think those are mutually exclusive at all. I think
Okay.
it's the sort of the extreme example is posting your political views on Facebook or social media. All that does is it unites people who already believe that to say, right on, and those that don't to go, you're crazy, and to move further away. So there's no uniting in that process. You are challenging, but you're not challenging in a way that's effective. And the pieces, like it takes zero leadership to do that. It takes zero influence. But if you can spark an idea in the mind of the opposition to make somebody who disagrees with you go, I never thought about it that way. That to me is the true definition of influence. That's where the real work comes into play. You go into I gotta Google his name because I remember it's Nick Carpenter or something like that. Nick something. He was a black man who decided to start having conversations with members of the Ku Klux Klan. And he just said, I'm just going to meet with them and listen. And he did that for years. And he's converted over 200 Klan members just by listening. And he didn't attack them. He didn't challenge. He just listened. And the proximity of that is so powerful. I mean, that is influence. And so I love your effort on and your goal of uniting. And so then go, okay, so I'll give you an example. This is a relevant and difficult one. And let's look at Palestine and Israel. Horrific on all angles. No one's winning this one. No one's winning at all. Children are being killed on both sides. And, you go back and the point of which people pick up history is the basis of their argument, and it all makes sense. You listen to, I think it makes sense. I've got some dear Jewish friends that are just going through hell right now. And I've heard stories on Palestinians and, then the media gets involved. I mean, God, where do you begin to have an opinion on this thing? And it's so difficult. And, even friends would have a hard time hearing me say, where do you have an opinion on this? And it's not that I don't see what's going on. I see all of that. But just that conversation brings so much emotion to the table that it's hard to get objective. Not saying you can't, and there are people that do, and I listen to as many of those as I can. And there are some pieces of this thing that seem to be pretty, and I say seem because I'm not an expert, irrefutable. And in that, saying, okay, how much influence is being achieved through posting about this versus, I'll give you another example, George Floyd, when that happened. That happened 15 minutes from my house, maybe 15, 20 minutes. Yeah, it takes me about 15 minutes to get there. And during that time, people were asking me, Renee, why aren't you more vocal on social media? And I said, vocal about what? I said, well, you're Cuban. I mean, shouldn't you be talking about how bad this is? I am vocal. I'm just not vocal on social media. It does nothing. I've had about 80 conversations with very influential white men over the last 3 weeks, and it's been exhausting, and it's been emotional, and it's been tear-jerking, and it's been heavy. But I don't post it on social media. For some reason, some of these men in power listen to me, and I can have conversations and I can listen. And one of the things that I saw during that time was not a popular opinion, that the most important voice during that was of white men. And like, what are you talking about? I said, because you have a lot of very powerful white men that are saying, how do I help? And then people that are radical biting their heads off. It's because of you guys that are doing this and you guys. And that person that wanted to help, who, by the way, has money, has the ability to employ, has status and influence, you could have had them on your side, but you attacked them. And so their response is, clam up, maybe I shouldn't say anything and just listen. Well, then nothing's happening. I go, how about we give them a voice in this? And so that we can create allies and help create some change that's going on instead of all this other shit that's going on. Now, those were my conversations. And I can't tell you how many times I had people that were on one side of thinking after that conversation go, man, I never thought about like this before. And they made some massive changes. Now that is influence. That is change. It didn't get me any social media views. Wasn't the goal.
Right.
Wasn't the purpose of it. And nor was that the platform, but it still created change.
I'm glad you brought it back to this, because it's almost like a full circle moment when we started off talking about your mom and the worldview and the context that she brought to the table and infused in you and your DNA and your personality and everything. And, you know, looking at you as a successful man in America who shares the rooms with all these other dudes in power, and I have felt like going through your content that you still have a pulse, you know, on other rooms and other people and deep empathy with other people groups. And I just sense that about you and your content. This is the first time I've ever met you. I feel like you get it, right? You can roll in both rooms, essentially, is what I'm saying. Kind of wrapping up this idea here of influence in this conversation, I guess a fear of mine, something that I've struggled with, is rolling in the successful rooms and elevating my brand and growing, but also to not losing the pulse of why I started at the very beginning, which was the underdog and the forgotten and people whose voice shake a little bit when they talk to others. How have you managed to keep a pulse on that and still scale your business and your brand?
I think what a lot of people don't see is the 30 years prior to this. And so when I say that, it's not because it's just because they had no insight to it. One, there was no social media back then. And two, I didn't have much of a social media presence, upwards of, until the last couple of years. And so I kind of did it backwards. I spent 30 years mastering a craft and then putting a brand around it versus creating this beautiful brand and then trying to fill it with some sort of expertise in content. So the reality is that other side, the humility is beaten into you over time in the reality of it. And I think in also realizing it's the self-conversation and self-reflection and being surrounded by really good people that will be like, René, what the hell are you doing? There's certain people that I know, the moment I embellish, the moment that I don't quote something correctly, like even me saying the quote around butterflies flying in formation, it's not my quote. It's the integrity behind that comes from an accountability of good people that will be like, what the hell are you doing, dude? And those people matter to me. And people say, well, you shouldn't do what matters. I said, no, there is a place for other people's opinions in that, because to me, it's part of the test of truth. Would those that I respect be okay with what I'm saying? And if the answer is no, would I say this to them? No. Then why am I saying it publicly? And that I think creates a really good filter by which to do things. And when you realize that, what your objective is, and you realize that you're there for a purpose, but when you are there for views, likes, climbing a social ladder, creating your influence, it's easy to lose sight of some of those things. Now, I'm not saying that, I'm perfect in that area, but I think that, your purpose, your mission is something so near and dear that I realized that the best way, and this came another lesson from my mother, because, she was a community builder, and then she got invited into the private sector and became very successful working with businesses and very large companies. And I remember as a kid, like, Mom, why don't you help these communities? Why are you helping all these rich people? And she said, René, she goes, for some reason, these men listen to me. And sometimes we are called to do certain things that we didn't plan. And for some reason, this is my calling. And that's the role I have to play. Some people play the role at the community level, which I played for many years. But for some reason, they're listening, and I have to serve that. And I was like, okay, that makes more sense. And so sometimes we just have to listen to who is listening to you and why. And maybe that's where you need to be. And maybe that's where you're best. And you don't get mad at other people for choosing their role or for being called into certain power, because we all have roles. If we were all doing the same thing, it wouldn't function. For some reason, this is my role. For some reason, this is your role, right? You're putting a podcast together that's done differently, and real conversations and thoughtful, and you clearly done your research. And so there's your role in that piece. But going back to your question around, managing the rooms, I think it's when you walk in that room and you're there to just listen and serve, you forget about rolling in a room. You're just in a room being you. And that's that's the unintentional ego, right? Unintentional. And I say that we all have that. The unintentional wanting to impress, because then that's when you start calculating which kind of room am I in? Should it matter? I don't think it does matter. Now, are there times where I got to play, get my A game? Yeah.
Right.
Do I need to understand the room from the percent of who the audience is? If I'm in a bunch of financial people, and storytelling probably isn't the first place I start. And so, what's going on, and there's certain arenas that you better add value quickly. And has nothing to do with me. That's just the style of the room, not my worthiness of the room. So some people confuse style of a room over their worth. Shouldn't do that.
Preach, y'all. One final question left for you, but before then, incredible book. Pick it up. Amplify your influence. Anything else that you want to direct our listeners to?
Follow me on Instagram. We got a free masterclass. I don't know when this is coming out. We got masterclass that we're putting out there. It's pretty cool. But yeah, I think, follow and listen to what Heather is talking about. I think your podcast, my prediction, it's going to continue to grow very, very fast. Stay on the path that you're on. You're doing something really cool. And by the way, the coolest things grow the slowest.
Ooh, somebody tweet that out. Word. Very last question. Questioning things. I think we always need to be in a spot where we're curious and pushing against stuff. What are you questioning right now? It can be related to our conversation here. It could be questioning something in spirituality. It could be questioning why in the world Taco Bell has breakfast burritos, because that makes zero sense. Not healthy, not a good idea. But what is something René is questioning right now in this season in your life?
Questions, reflection is one of the core elements of who I am. And I believe that reflection is one of the highest forms of prayer. Like, you can go back to the story of creation. 6 days created earth, rested one. But at the end of each day, he asked himself, did I do good? Which is reflection. And I think through reflection and questioning is the only way you can assess your life, and the only way you begin the process of changing for the better or continue doing something good. So I think that's a beautiful question. I think, there's a lot of things that I'm questioning. I'm questioning, am I doing this business right? Am I approaching this correctly? Because I watch, and I know the answer. I thought the speaker fee was my goal, like the highest speaker fee. That was the goal. And I spoke 239 days last year at my highest speaker fee ever. And it didn't achieve the goal I wanted. I was gone all the time. Influence grew, so maybe, and I get it was a season, but it's not that. And I watch people that are, have a quarter of the experience that I do, go on stage and they do their business very differently, and they're at home. So I'm going, I don't think I'm doing it correctly. And so we've been engaging on different things like free masterclasses, which is different. We never did anything free. Everything was always $6,000 minimum just to be part of a class of mine. And we'd sell them all out and all that stuff. But, looking at new ways of reaching more people while still achieving our financial goals it's where we're questioning. So we're in deep process change on that. And here's the best part is that I'll be doing it again next year, and I'll be doing it again next year, and I'll be doing it until the day I die, questioning, are we doing this right?
Well, the folks I mentioned at the beginning were so right. You are kind and generous. Thank you so much for your time today. And also just privately encouraging me along the way in the path that I've been on. I don't take that for granted at all. And your words mean a lot to me. So René, it was an honor to have you on the show.
The pleasure was all mine, and happy to do it anytime.